Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with you. And I have an interesting little conversation we're going to have today. But first, I want to start off with the classic reminder that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This does not constitute working with a licensed mental health provider. Please seek out one in your area. And if need be, consider online. Because, there are many in your state that can still help. So today's podcast, which is in celebration for Pride Month, and it's our podcast that will be wrapping up this very celebrative month. An interesting fellow that I've seen and read some of his work over the years, and then attending a Christmas get-together. We actually had a chance to chat, and as they put it, is like, wow, someone who's not actually getting glazed over trying to talk about these things with comics. Yeah, so I'm a girl. As it is, I'm a geek, blurred nerd all to the head. So who we're talking about today is Justin Hall. Justin Hall is a cartoonist, educator, and scholar. He is a creator or co-creator of True Travel Tales, Hard to Swallow, and the Theater of Terror, Revenge of the Queers, and was in the publication has worked in publications such as the Houghton Mifflin Best American Comics. You can tell. I'll let them actually tell us how that's actually pronounced, because my dyslexia gets in the way there.
Yeah, it's Houghton Mifflin. Houghton Mifflin.
Okay, Houghton Mifflin. The Best Erotic Comics and the SF Weekly. He edited the Lambda Award-winning and Eisner-nominated collections No Straight Lines for 4 decades of queer comics, and was a producer of the feature-length documentary film of the same name. Hall is the chair of the MFA in Comics program at California College of the Arts and the first Fulbright Scholar of Comics, and has curated international exhibits of comics and arts and written about comics for academic publication. He is at work on graphic novels, weaving memoirs of LGBT San Francisco history for the Abram Books. So, Justin, welcome to Untying Knots.
Hello there. Thank you so much for having me.
Not a problem. And thank you for correcting my pronunciation on that earlier too.
No worries. It's a tricky one. It looks but it's the Houghton Mifflin series has been going on for a while, and it's really it took them a while to actually get their comics line up. It started in 2006, and it's because they have a Houghton Mifflin Best American Poetry, Best American Short Stories, best all these different genres and media. And finally, they finally added Best American Comics to it.
Gotcha. Well, we're going to talk about comics in just a second, but let me ask the classic question of, how did you get here?
Well, it's funny. I was just having a conversation with my mother about this, and she sort of looked at me. She was like, "You took your weird childhood obsession with comics and your later obsession with queer comics and somehow made a career out of it." How did that happen? I don't know if I have a great explanation, but I do think about this actually in regards to my students. Because my students come out of our program, and we try to prepare them for a career of some kind, right? And I sort of fell into mine in various sort of through a amalgam of pure luck and sort of dumb luck, and some planning and some bullheadedness. Wound up where I am. For a long time, I was a massage therapist for over 25 years. I love that work, actually. It really activated another part of my brain, my holistic gestalt sort of brain, and also sensual brain in terms of the senses, and intuitive, right? It's a very intuitive process to figure out the body and how it manages pain and tightness and all this stuff, and very different from the analytical work that I do as a scholar and the creative work that I do as a comics artist. So I did that for many years, and that was my primary source of income for many years. But now, then I started teaching about 12 years ago, I guess now, at CCA, California College of the Arts. First in the undergraduate program, teaching comics through the writing and literature department, and then we created the MFA in comics program, which I just became the chair of this year, or last year. So that's been a big shift, and I don't have to do massage anymore, and sort of have given that up, and just make my living now with making comics themselves and through my art, and then also through teaching, which I really love, and some administrative duties.
Oh yes, those administrative duties. Don't we all just love doing that paperwork?
Oh yeah, spreadsheets totally turn me on. They're great. Super cool.
Yeah. I know you can hear the sarcasm in my voice, folks, people. But that said, and you said we weren't going to even talk about massage, but hey, you brought it in.
Yeah.
But getting back to the aspect of comics, I mean, some would say that we've had quite the renaissance in this last 20 years with comics and the comic shows, as well as all the movies with both MCU and the DCU, which is Marvel and DC Comics universe, for those who aren't aware of this. And yet also the standpoint of some would say we're hitting a fatigue of that. What do you think about all of
that? Unfortunately, in a lot of ways, it's been wonderful to see the sort of the intellectual properties of the mainstream comics world, American industry, the Marvel and DC universes in particular. It's been wonderful to see them being translated onto screen and sort of have this other life. Unfortunately, that hasn't meant necessarily big increases in comic sales. So that the comics industry itself sort of doesn't get as much of that blowback as it probably should. It's superheroes. I actually teach the history of comics class for my incoming cohort, and we go into history about everything from bande dessinée, the sort of the Franco-Belgian European comics, to manga, the Japanese comics, but also North American comics. And there is a sort of peculiar history to North American comics, which is that there was this big explosion of superhero stuff at the very end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s. By the time we came out of World War II, American population was completely disinterested in superheroes. The superheroes were absolutely out of fashion. There's only 3 of them left after many, hundreds were created, and then they all went out of print. And what became really popular was romance, crime, and horror comics in particular, but all different kinds of genres, but particularly those ones. And we started, especially with the romance comics, we started to see an increase of female readership, and the readership was getting older, right? It wasn't just anymore. What was happening was what ended up happening in the manga market, really, where there was expansion of material and readership. But then there was backlash against that with the tail end of the McCarthy era, and this idea that all these sort of unfettered comics material was causing juvenile delinquency in our kids and young adults. So there was this massive blowback. There was a book called Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wortham that came out in 1954 that basically said that these crime comics were creating juvenile delinquents of our children, and Batman and Robin and Wonder Woman were making our children gay and lesbian, which fair enough. That I actually do see that point. I think Wonder Woman does probably made me gay, but yeah, I mean, so then the Comics Code Authority comes down in 1954. It's the most severe sort of draconian form of censorship of any popular culture art form in American history. And you get these really incredible rules, like you can't show any disrespect for a person of authority, a policeman or a judge or a teacher. You can never, the villain must always lose and be punished for his crimes. There can never be any like sexual perversion, or all sexuality must be towards the sanctity of marriage. Queer stuff. You can never have zombies or werewolves or vampires. No undead are allowed in the comics. all of this stuff happens in 54. It's this incredible, it basically eliminates all these other burgeoning genres, and all that's left is like Richie Rich and anthropomorphic comics, Mickey Mouse and stuff, and the couple of superhero titles that were still left.
Mm-hmm.
And then right after, and a couple of years later, superheroes get, and that almost ends the American comics industry. More than half the publishers went under. It became a sort of dirty word to make comics, and it was synonymous with the worst depravities. And then superheroes get reimagined in the mid 50s, and then Marvel Comics comes in 1961, and superheroes are further reimagined and become this dominant genre. So we're stuck with this weird industry in which this entire medium, which is capable of anything, right? You can make comics about anything, just like you can write literature about anything or make songs about anything. But we're stuck in the United States with a medium that is 90% this one weird genre. So I make erotica, I make travel stories, I make memoir, I make horror comics, I do all these queer narratives, and all these things that would be fairly mainstream genres in most media, but because they're comics and they don't have American comics, they don't have muscular men and women in spandex shooting laser beams from their eyeballs. It's considered alternative or independent. So, which is a little bit frustrating. I love superheroes and I grew up with them and I have a lot of thoughts about them and we've talked about them for sure. But it's also it's a love-hate relationship, right? Because it's incredibly infuriating that it dominates the publishing landscape for comics so completely. And you really, if you want to get out of that, now there's ways you can go to the book publishers, which is what I'm doing with this latest book. I'm doing a big memoir and mixed with elements of queer San Francisco history, and that book's going to be published by Abrams Books, which is a big book publisher, mainstream book publisher. But the comics industry itself is still sort of dominated by superheroes,
right? As well as then there's also the genre of the graphic novels too, which more than also enough authors just doing other work have converted into, like the recent Kindred one by John Jennings, which is off of Octavia Butler's work, or Tanana Reeve Dew's The Keeper ones as well, which I've got a few of those too.
Yeah, so John actually teaches with us. He's one of my faculty members at CCA, and he also runs the Megascope line for Abrams. So he's the group editor for a line of graphic novels by Cartoonist of Color,
which I've got a couple of those books.
Okay.
And I'd love to meet him at some point. So more of that. But what you just illustrated with that history is a very interesting one too. If you consider what we consider, obviously at that time, especially from the standpoint of mental health, wasn't where it is now, and the realization of you're looking at a period of generation that has come back from dealing with World War II. You've got a lot of people dealing with unrecognized PTSD, which also adds to this whole corruption of youth, and because you've got so many families being broken up by the unrecognized, undiagnosed, and untreated PTSD. Not to mention then too this notion, like what you said there about who you have to be friendly towards authority and so forth, considering that authority was some of the things that brought this war about. And two, to the aspect that the idea that the comics could only be quote unquote for kids.
Absolutely.
So all of that sits into and becomes a part of the thinking of a couple of generations.
And I would add that it's also, because it's a visual medium, it's sort of considered more lurid, and that it's illustrated. It gives it dangerous quality, I think, in the minds of a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists. I mean, Frederick Wertham was a psychiatrist, a German-born American psychiatrist who had this crusade against comics because he was convinced that it was causing juvenile delinquency in American youth, and his methodology was terrible. He was wrong. And there was a Senate investigation into comics that couldn't find any causal relationship. But it's a sort of societal debate that's happened over and over and over again, whether it's the Satanic Panic from Dungeons and Dragons games to video games to, and the comic strips were initially considered, they were taking children away from the church because there were all these, full color pages happening on Sunday, and they were, distracting children from God. So there's always been sort of psychiatric / psychological / sort of religious and cultural arguments against popular culture for, as long as we've had it. I guess I would say about comics, there's also, it's connected also to the concept of a teenager, right? So the teenager didn't really exist before World War II. You were an adult child, and then you became an adult.
Right.
And the emergence of a sort of liminal, identity.
Space.
Which was, has its own culture, and that culture is actually sort of in opposition oftentimes to adult culture. It was, absolutely terrifying to the adults at the time. And we think of sort of rock and roll as being the first, as being the battleground of that. But really the first battleground was comics. And unfortunately, the adults won.
Right.
The comics got authority.
Right. Well, and also the nature of who's being able to pay for the paper, the printing.
Sure.
The distribution of those things. And of course, there's also then that battle one too when we start bringing in LGBT elements.
Yeah, and there was and certainly all different kinds of marginalized voices that were there was more opportunity for marginalized creators in the realm of comics because of the sort of Wild West nature of it, right? As opposed to more established media like magazine illustration or something like that, or radio. So you did have and also the comic book industry, which is really distinct from the comic strip industry. The comic book industry really comes out of the Jewish immigrant experience in the United States. So almost entirely created by those early comics, the Golden Age and even the Silver Age, entirely created by first and second generation Jewish boys living in the ghettos. And I use the word ghetto from its original meaning, which is Jewish neighborhood. In New York City. So so even a lot of the sort of more, some of the names like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who essentially created the Marvel Universe, they were Stanley Lieber and Jakob Kurtzberg. So it was anglicized names. Bob Kane, who created Batman, was actually Bob Kahn. So they're mostly, so that, you're talking before about this idea of trauma, generational trauma coming out of World War II. Well, even before that, there was generational trauma coming from these Jewish creators whose families were oftentimes fleeing the Holocaust, and they were creating superheroes and other sorts of comics coming out of their own experiences and their families' experiences. Which
just again shows how much our need for escape and escapism is a very critical thing, and what it takes and what gets created that we turn into a more healing modality, because how many people have enjoyed or found comics to be, in whatever form they take, far beyond the superhero ones, to be a methodology for addressing healing, such as one of the classic ones in the graphic novel series is I Kill Monsters, which I know is a movie that was made mid like 2015 or so forth. But I remember introducing my supervisor at the time, one of my supervisors, to the idea of like, oh, here's a graphic novel, and it's talking about, for those who haven't read it, talking about the subject of death and processing that. And that was an eye-opening for her to be able to see that, like, okay, here's another way to explore grief.
Absolutely. I mean, that's that sort of cathartic nature, or addressing difficult subjects is, obviously you can do that in any medium, and of course I'm biased. I think comics are the best medium. So, but you do see a lot of that, and you see increasingly in modern comics, right? A lot of web comics, a lot of, especially like queer comics, comics by people of color, other marginalized groups, oftentimes talking about their experiences and their traumas in particular. There's a lot of stuff around mental health, for example, in comics form that's increasingly important. There's a whole movement called graphic medicine, which is basically this idea of addressing issues around health in comics form, and a lot of that is mental health comics. And you can really get at issues around mental health and really profoundly, 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 really pro profoundly accessible, but also deep ways, right? There's a recent book I just read, Something at the Center of the Earth. I will look that up, but by a very young woman dealing with really severe depression. And she draws her depression as this sort of monster that sort of looms behind her. And it's extraordinary. And it's something that it's a depiction of mental disorder in comics form, using the comics form to do this in a way that is absolutely both haunting, engaging, deeply empathic, and quite powerful.
Which is that aspect that sometimes cannot be put into classic statement. There are no words for it.
Yes.
So trying to put it in the prose form, which is a wonderful art form, but this does not always carry the same thing as the impact of an image.
Yeah, agreed. But comics are still narrative, right? So you can still sort of have a more than simply a sort of a one painting or something like that, which you can certainly cross a lot in that too. But comics have that additional. They have the advantage of being both visual but also narrative, so that you can construct more complex ideas through the course of the pages that build a comic than you can in a single painting, for example.
Yeah. And much the aspect of what it means for our queer stories. So absolutely. Some of the work you've done, which was the Hard to Swallow and of course the Theater of Terror. So let's talk a little more about those, as we're talking about some of the queer narratives that get to show up in the comic book or the graphic novel industries.
So I created Hard to Swallow and started in 2006, and it's an erotic series. I had been making True Travel Tales and some other stories as well. And my friend Dave Davenport, who came to me, I always wanted to work with him, and he came to me and said, "Okay, I'm ready to do a comic with you." I was like, "Great." He was like, "I want it to be porn." I'm like, "Okay, all right, here we go." I hadn't thought about doing that, but it ended up being really good for me in my artistic evolution, because I was coming out of a generation of indie cartoonists, like Daniel Clowes, Chris Ware, the Hernandez brothers, people who specialized in sort of understatement. Everything was, the cameras pulled back a bit, everything sort of small panels. It's a very restrained aesthetic. Adrian Tomine, people like that.
Could you repeat that the last couple of seconds? We had a glitch come up.
Oh yeah, sure. So I was coming out of this sort of 90s indie comic, early 2000s indie comic aesthetic, which is very sort of, has a sort of coldness to it, where the camera's often pulled back, oftentimes small panels. So people like Adrian Tomine, Daniel Clowes, Chris Ware, the Hernandez brothers, to a certain extent. And it's very restrained. It's known for its sort of restrained energy, and you can't do that with porn. It's just, that doesn't work with porn. So you have to do the big dramatic, money shots. You've got to do the more dramatic storytelling elements, and it forced me to break out of my own mold. I started doing these, angled panels and sort of, decompressing the storytelling. Fewer panels per page, fewer words per page. Thinking more, manga does that quite well, for example. And it really broadened my abilities as a cartoonist. I'm really glad I did this porn comics. And also, we wanted to make sure, David and I wanted to make sure that we approached erotica differently. It's often, I believe that sex and sexuality and desire are one of the most profound elements of human existence, right? That's something that we have as a species that's, this remarkable blessing. It's very different from any other species. And it represents one of the great profundities of the human and mysteries of the human experience. It's up there with life and with birth and death, right? And why are we oftentimes making really bad art about it? Because usually most pornographic art is terrible. And not as challenging as the subject matter. So we wanted to make erotic comics that were interesting and challenging, and also hot, like you could jerk off to, or you could, think about, or both, right? So, for example, like I was talking to this one friend, I used to do porn myself. I was a porn actor for a while, and I had met this woman who was she was a femdyke who would write gay male porn reviews under an assumed male pseudonym. But she was talking to me, and she said, "Well, I used to strap my tits down and go and suck guys off in the back of the Powerhouse Bar, which is this gay cruising bar in San Francisco." And that was just fascinating to me. So I did a comic about it, and I tried to make it really sexy. It's an erotic comic about with her sucking these guys off, and then she gets caught, and she was caught actually by this one guy, and the guy then got more turned on because it was so sort of edgy for him to discover that it was actually a woman sucking him off, and then he got even more excited. So, but I wanted that to talk about how gender is fluid and sexuality is fluid, and it's sort of an interesting thing, but it's going to also be arousing. So, so that was our attempt with this work, was to make stuff that was good narratively, challenging, interesting narratives, but also hot. And Theater of Terror is also taking the genre of horror and using that for queer purposes. I edited the anthology with William O. Tyler. I put the thing together with Peaches Christ to help as well. She's the sort of Elvira character that's sort of lacing the book together. Wrote for the stories, illustrated one of them, and brought all the other cartoonists. And it was really a wonderful experience putting that book together, to see how queer creators would approach horror in so many different ways. Everything from like camp humor to psychological horror to horror to and taking the sort of like queer spins on all of it. So that was really fun. The other thing, the book I'm most known for is the 4 Decades of Queer Comics, which is a compendium of LGBTQ plus comics from the late 60s through when it was published, which was 2012. And that was sort of, it took years of research, and I basically dug through all these different archives, finding and talking to creators and finding this material that was mostly published within a queer media bubble that was really distinct from the rest of the comics world. It was in a parallel universe to the rest of the comics industry. Queer material was usually serialized in queer newspapers, collected and published, published by queer presses, underground, lesbian or gay presses, distributed by queer distributors, sold in feminist and queer bookstores. So they existed within their own parallel, their own little universe, and had nothing to do with the comic book stores or comic conventions or anything like that. So I was worried as that media bubble was disintegrating, because we ended up losing almost all of the queer newspapers and bookstores and everything, and publishers. I was worried that material would be lost. So that was my impetus to gather all of that and really create as close to a comprehensive history of that as I could.
What do you think was one of the biggest factors in that sort of disintegration?
I think some of it was the rise of like Barnes and Noble and these big sort of conglomerates that put all things that were independent or underground at jeopardy. Part of it was also the increasing acceptance of queer people, right? To get a book out there in the world early on, bookstores wouldn't sell this material. So you had to go to a specialist bookstore. You had to stay within this community in order to get the book out there, get the work out there. So you could only, talk about queer issues in queer newspapers. Mainstream newspapers didn't want to talk about queerness. They wanted to pretend it didn't exist. So as we became more accepted, it became it became less necessary. So Barnes and Noble would have a queer section, and that took away a lot of the need for the queer media bubble. The problem is that as that falls apart, you lose some of this internal conversation that was happening within community, right? So some of this material could, move over into a mainstream setting and have no problem sort of making that leap, but something couldn't. So something like Diane DeMasa's Hothead Paisan Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist never be mainstream, right? It's not moving over to the mainstream bookstores.
Yeah, which is a part of the larger conversation we're also having in our communities too, about losing spaces and recognizing what spaces, what they meant, and what were placed, what could they also permit us to explore that can't be, shall we say, in the mainstream and main acceptance.
Exactly.
factor. So, okay. So let's let that sink in for our folks here. And I think this is a good place for us to take a break. So stay tuned for our second half here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Justin Hall, cartoonist, educator, and scholar. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back shortly.
Follow Voice America at facebook.com/Voice America for juicy updates from your favorite radio shows and podcasts.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Enjoying our shows and can't get enough of us? Follow us on Instagram at Voice America Talk Radio and see what we're cooking up for you.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingnotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingnotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello, all. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage family therapist, here with Justin Hall, cartoonist, educator, and scholar. So we've just been talking a bit about comics, and especially queer comics and the work that Justin has been doing. But you were also talking about in one of your more recent projects in our off period here, talking about some poster work you've been doing. So could you enlighten us more on that, please?
Yeah, actually, it's apropos of this discussion during Pride Month. In 2020, I was commissioned by the San Francisco Arts Commission to do a series of posters that were installed in the bus kiosks along Market Street, which is the main thoroughfare of San Francisco, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Pride, of San Francisco Pride. And so what I did was I researched 6 moments in queer San Francisco history, and I attached a color to each one of them to represent the 6 colors of the rainbow flag. So and I created these poster-sized comics that were installed in the bus kiosks, each one sort of monochromatically colored. One of them was the founding of the Daughters Bolitas, which is the first lesbian organization. There was Compton's Cafeteria Riots, which was this moment where drag queens and gender nonconforming folks fought back against the police 3 years before Stonewall. The running of Jose Sadia for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the first time an openly queer person had run for political office in the United States, and also a sort of a moment of early drag queen activism. And the Toolbox, which was the first gay leather bar that was in South of Market, and the sort of formation of the Toolbox, and its legendary mural by Chuck Arnett, and then the first Pride itself. So it was really an interesting project because as we were talking about before, queer comics were always existed in a parallel universe to the rest of the world and to the rest of the comics market. And that's changed quite a bit recently. So since my book came out, the No Straight Lines book came out, we've seen queer comics and queer graphic novels win, Eisner Awards and sort of be, centered in the industry, which has been a remarkable transformation and really quite exciting. But this was sort of a further evolution of this, where basically this was public art that was totally queer. I was really interested in the idea that people who don't even read comics could be walking down the street and just see this work and read it. And after this history, the still fairly hidden history of San Francisco, because queer history is usually swept under the rug. Doesn't usually get passed down within families. It's not in textbooks. So you really have to sort of dig to find it, but it's really important history, right? So, and it's important not only for queer communities, but just for the sort of overall makeup and legacy of San Francisco as a city, and influences all sorts of different kinds of communities. So it was really exciting for me that this idea that people could just be walking down the street and discover this stuff and start reading it. And comics are a very intimate reading form. It's usually a small book, and you sort of open it up, and it's a personal, engagement. But public art is very different. So that was just really exciting to know that people who don't read comics, who wouldn't ever open something up and may have no normal interest in or access to queer history, would see this material. And also queers walking down the street would see it and say, oh, right, this is the legacy that of my community. These are the people who fought for me to have the rights that I have now. And let's honor them, right? And let's discover their histories and honor them.
Which sort of brings up something that I know I've heard on another podcast, but I've spoken with one or two other people, which may show up in some of the previous episodes of this, was the fact that for every culture, usually your family is part of the way of knowing and understanding and maintaining that. But when it comes to those of us as LGBT queer, we have to basically establish our family of choice to start knowing and maintaining that history, if it is at all, let alone being taught. And equally, and another part to that element of our disappearing spaces is also the financial wealth in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a community in community building and sort of history and legacy is very, very different for queer communities than others, precisely for the reasons that you said. We're lucky in San Francisco to have community organizations such as the GLBT Historical Society and the James Cornell Center in the San Francisco Public Library, for example, the Her Story Archives, places where you could find queer history, but you still need to know where to look. You still need to dig, right? It's been interesting. After doing this poster project, my agent and I pitched it as a book to Abrams, and this is where I got my contract for the Abrams book. But the initial pitch was, let's do this book about queer San Francisco history. I'd already done all the research for these chapters, and I would put little bits of interstitial memoir elements in between the different chapters in order to kind of give everything context. But Abrams looked at this project and said, well, we can't sell a book of regional queer history, but we can sell a memoir, a graphic memoir, because the book publishers in general still have a sort of hard time getting their imagination around what graphic novels can do. And so what they really know is Fun Home, Persepolis, and Mouse, right? And they're all memoirs in some way, right? So now my book is an inverse of what I pitched. It's mostly memoir, with little elements of, small chapters of queer San Francisco history embedded within it, sort of woven within the narrative. But one of the things that, so I have to talk about my own gay ass life in San Francisco. I've been here for over 25 years and been pretty gay the whole time. So, and then how does my life now intersect with, how has it been influenced by these moments in queer San Francisco history that I didn't even really know about necessarily until fairly recently. But there are senses of legacy, and how do we imagine a future? It's easier to imagine a future once you understand the course of the past, course of history. One of the things that you mentioned, like, how do you disseminate culture? How do you kind of continue culture when you're not doing it through family? Well, we also have the added problem, my generation, I believe yours, that with HIV/AIDS,
right? Basically, eliminate an entire section.
I mean, yeah, essentially
generations.
Just got just bulldozed. And so what it meant was the sort of older men that should have been bringing us into the community and sort of teaching us, our daddies, so to speak, right? Like they weren't there; they were fighting for their lives. So it's, it's really, it's especially important to be able to honor people with our histories who lost their lives, and we're able to sort of live out the completion of their lives that should have been.
Oh yeah, and that's actually been a subject I've talked with a couple of my clients about, who happen to be older gay men, and the standpoint of the said is like, well, we don't actually have good examples of what does it mean for an older, mature man, gay man, to be restarting relationship or dealing or even seeing older gay couples, the LGBT, lesbian, trans, dealing with life and dealing with life issues. I mean, we've only got the standard Ma and Pa Kent.
No, that's right.
Which in and of itself is becoming very much a rarity, as again, the traumas that people have not been paying attention to are also showing up and dividing these relationships.
And the fact that we didn't have that model for us means that as we then provide that service for younger gay men or younger queer men, bi and gay men, that we don't have the proper training. So there's sort of like a ripple effect that carries down for generations from this time. One of the things that I was really happiest about, I was the producer of a feature-length documentary film, No Straight Lines, Queer Comics, which sort of comes out of my book. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that we were able to show Howard Cruz, who's sort of the godfather of gay comics, with his partner Ed Cedarbaum, and they were older gay men. Howard since passed, unfortunately, but we showed them sort of sitting in their armchairs in front of the television, with their TV tray, dinner trays, and eating dinner and giving each other a smooch and sort of commenting on. And it's delightful, and you realize. And it's so heartwarming, and you realize you so rarely see images of older gay men just in sort of living a normal life and loving each other.
Same thing with women, same thing for our trans, so and non-binary, which is becoming now a factor as we have more people going past age 30.
Yes,
and having relationships. So who knows? Maybe it's one of your next pieces.
Oh yeah, no, we actually had so the other people in that movie are Alison Bechdel, who did Fun Home and Dykes to Watch Out For, Mary Winks, who created the first lesbian comic book, Jen Camper, who's an incredible lesbian cartoonist from New York, and Rupert Kennard, who created the first queer Black characters in comics. And so we got to see some different kinds of modeling for that generation. But I do think that queer men in particular they got decimated by AIDS, and so it's really important for us to see that.
Very true. So with all of this is also creating these materials and so forth. How is the education around comics, and especially informing the next generation of queer artists that are developing comics, comic books, comic strips, and graphic novels?
That's so another aspect of the film is that we filmed with the focus of the film were these 5 pioneers of queer comics from that generation. But then we wanted to have we had a Greek chorus essentially of younger cartoonists who were commenting upon the work that the pioneers had done. And it both provides context for the work of the pioneers, but it also shows the audience that queer comics have evolved and continue to evolve and bring in different kinds of voices. And that was really wonderful. And having that sort of intergenerational communication was really important. So Jen Camper and I also put together the Queers in Comics conference. Jen in New York, and I helped her moving forward in San Francisco and back to New York. And one of the things that we did was put these different generations in conversation with each other. So, for example, one of my former students, Lawrence Lindell, a queer Black cartoonist, was able to then meet Rupert and be in a panel with him, and he could sort of see that Rupert had, been fighting this fight back in the late, 70s of Black queer representation, and so that he wasn't alone in creating this kind of material now, that he had a sort of role model to look to, and then Rupert could in turn see that his struggles or his his output ended up having this wonderful ripple effect where he could open the doors for people to create, more of this work in the future. And then we were able to film that in the movie, and sort of film Lawrence talking about Rupert and sort of the importance of seeing Rupert's work. That was, that's incredibly heartwarming. As an educator, like that's what you live for, those sort of moments.
And more of your work with what you're doing at the California College of Arts too, because I think, as you mentioned, there is not much like what you said with the Miffin award. It's like they took a while for them to have a comics branch of this. What's it like teaching there with this branch for comics, and how can more of our LGBT interested artists find their way to you?
Yeah, please, we have a BFA and an MFA now in comics at CCA, and they're extremely queer friendly. I'll say that our faculty is probably half queer, it's there's been this remarkable, as I said, evolution from the early days where queer comics were so marginalized to now queer comics are very much centered in the industry, and that. It's really reflected by our program, which is, again, has a lot of faculty, students, and who are queer and BIPOC, and also the reading lists that we provide, and sort of content, the educational content that we provide, really sort of try to center all these voices that they used to be so extremely marginalized. But yeah, it's been really wonderful to see comics, which were I love the DIY aspect of comics. I love the fact that there is this sort of punk rock, DIY history to comics that's really hardwired into it, where you can really make great comics with a ballpoint pen, some pieces of paper, and a photocopy machine if you have to, right? And people have for decades. So, but at the same time, it's a really profoundly complex and interesting and rich art form, and so deserves scholarly interest and deserves programs, in higher education that make this to focus on making this kind of material. So, I'm very proud of the fact that we get to be sort of this one of the first generation, basically the first generation, to really take it to this level of. In the academic world. I'm sort of jealous of my own students. I wish that I had a program that I could have gone to and studied comic art when I was taking college, but it's wonderful to be able to provide that, and really exciting to make comics and study comics at that level.
Very nice. Very nice. So let's go ahead and wrap this into my classic question is, what do you, especially given that this is for Pride Month and we're going to be focusing on LGBT components in this, what do you think are some of the myths and realities around mental health, especially for us as LGBT, but also for those of us who love comics?
I think it's important to think about representation and how that and what that means. How do we see ourselves in the world? How do we see ourselves reflected back in the world? So representation really matters. It literally saves lives. It's really important that we not only have material within the mainstream that is maybe not about.
Sorry, we hit the glitch again.
Yeah, no worries. Should I start with representation? Yeah. So I think it's important to think about representation, that representation really matters. Like, it literally saves lives. And it's important for us to be able to see ourselves reflected back at us from the world, as to confirm, to validate our own existence, basically. And think about Mary Wings, who is in our film and in the book. She created the first lesbian comic book. She didn't know the word lesbian until she was 19. She thought that she was completely alone and had no idea that she was, that anyone else was like her. And if she went into the library to try to find books about this or something, all she would find would be things about it being a mental disorder. So to have, and then she basically was like, okay, I'm going to make the first comic book about coming out as a lesbian, so I can make sure that people younger than me don't have this experience, like that they can see themselves, find some sort of media to see themselves reflected back to themselves in a healthy way. I think that's extremely important. It's important also within the mainstream, right? So in the past, the mainstream comics would completely eschew any sort of queer content or characters or themes or plots. Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics in the 1980s, famously said that there were no gays in the Marvel universe. He just didn't exist. Right. There's nothing homoerotic about these men and women dressed in spandex, like grappling with each other. So it's up to the queer underground basically to provide representation. But then that's changed, and now you have a lesbian Batwoman, you've got a bisexual Superman. And that's really important. We need that, right? It's especially for younger audiences that maybe want to see themselves for the first time, reflected back, and it sort of validates their identity. However, it's not really the job of Batwoman or a Superman to talk about really deep, complex issues around queer identities, right? It's not. It's more the place of the queer comics to dissect and analyze and celebrate and poke fun at and do the sort of deep work around identity and community building, all that stuff. So we need both of those things, right? But I would say that there's a danger of the one qualifier I would have about representation is that we also can't just assume that representation is a sort of one-to-one affair. So, for example, in the X-Men, my favorite X-Men was always Storm.
Mine too.
I mean, she's the coolest, right? And there's even I'm a white gay man. There's now a white gay X-Men character, North Star. Never really liked North Star. I'm glad he exists. I'm glad that there is that representation, but representation is not about a one-to-one, right? So Storm is still my favorite and could kick North Star's ass anytime.
Yeah. And they need to do much better writing for her, and even a couple of story arcs that have just been purely hers. It's just can we bring in some Black female writers to continue to flesh her out, because she is such a dynamic character and under-respected.
Yeah, I agree. And there is that sort of it's interesting. It brings up this issue which is related to the idea of representation about sort of creators' identities, the relationship between that and the characters that they create, right? And I will say that that is something my students think about a lot, and we think about a lot as faculty. We're at a moment culturally where there's two different forces, sort of opposing forces. One is that we, as creators, we need to create more diverse characters and world building and storylines that really represent the diversity of the actual diversity of the world around us, right? That's an incredibly important project to do. On the other hand, we're also told to stay in our lanes, that we should presume to write for someone else's experience. So those two things, obviously, there are times when they sort of butt up against each other. Threading that line can be quite challenging. So it's an interesting moment to make work, right? How do you? So, for example, in my book I'm doing with Abrams, based on these poster project. My memoir, I'm writing the whole thing, but my memoir segments I'm illustrating, but I'm bringing in other illustrators to illustrate the historical chapters whose identities more closely aligned with the subject matters of those chapters. So, for example, the Compton's Cafeteria riots is being illustrated by Bishak Som, who's a trans woman of color. Not that Bishak's life experiences really directly relate in any sort of one-to-one way with the queens that revolted against the cops at Compton's, but she has a different perspective on transness than I possibly could, right? So that collaboration, I think, will yield really fruitful results. But it's an interesting moment. What's the power of representation? I think it got incredible psychological and sociological power. What are its limits? And how do we, as creators and audience members, readers, engage with that?
Very nice. Well, where can folks find you and find more of this work? Because there's your website, more links to Abrams. So where can folks find you if they want questions or they want to find their way into your class?
Well, please come check out if you're interested in getting an MFA or a BFA in comics. Please visit California College of the Arts, so cca.edu for sure. And then my own work is at Justin Hall Awesomecomics.com. Justin Hall Comics got swiped by some hacker, the trolls and hackers out there. I don't know what happened, but it's Justin Hall Awesome Comics, all one word, .com. And the film is No Straight Lines, thefilm.com. Mm-hmm. And there's links to my publishers, Fantagraphics, Abrams, Northwest Press, on my website.
All right.
Material there.
Well, Justin, I want to thank you so much for coming and having this chat with me, and being able to have all our listeners to hear about this history and hopefully get a better understanding that it's not just all about the spandex.
Spandex is fun.
It's fun, and it can be very nice and form shaping. But it's not all about the spandex.
Well, that's a wonderful way to leave us on a Pride Month, Barry. I appreciate that. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Likewise. So please, folks, check in next time for our next podcast here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be safe and enjoy your Pride.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.